What have the social and reputational consequences been for holding that position?
It's a great question. I think intellectually, emotionally, yes, very difficult. A great question. It's one of the hardest questions we have to deal with. And look, yeah, it's just the dumbest and most naive argument that's out there right now. And I hear it from liberals, leftists, conservatives, apolitical people, normies.
We mentioned Piers Morgan, and we have to address that particular elephant in the room. You took my suggestion and challenged him to come on Mehdi Unfiltered. Did he ever respond?
We've tried to get him on Mehdi Unfiltered. We've tried to get him. We're right now trying to get him on Head to Head, the Al Jazeera English show in London. While I'm in London, I'd love to do him in front of a crowd. Piers, if you're watching, we'd love to get you on Head to Head very soon.
Would you have a conversation with Destiny? Well, here at Pondering Politics, we've talked about this year wanting to have interviews with interesting people. And as you know, if you follow this channel, I have certain white whales that I desperately want. And I bagged him finally, Mehdi Hasan, my favorite progressive political commentator.
Thank you so much.
Mehdi, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
No, I appreciate it. So listen, I know I've got you for about 30 minutes. I want to be respectful of your time. First things first, I want to congratulate you on the success of Zateo, of which I am proud to be a founding member, by the way.
Thank you so much.
And my question is, what's next? Are we going to get daily episodes of Mehdi Unfiltered, high-profile collaborations? Are we going to get a tour a la Pod Save America? What's next for you?
That's a good question. I like the tour idea. I'm going to have to take that back to the team. The Mehdi Unfiltered is our weekly streaming show right now. We also have a podcast, We're Not Kidding. We're in a very good position right now in that we actually have too much stuff. So we're kind of looking around thinking what works, what's not working, what should we do more of? So I welcome feedback from your viewers and listeners, from Zateo subscribers. What do they want to see more of? We could do a daily show. The election is taking up a lot of time. I feel like I haven't slept for about 4 months. It's been an insanely busy time. And, you know, we did a live show recently with the podcast, which was a lot of fun in DC with a live audience. I love doing live shows. I do a live interview show for Al Jazeera called Head to Head. I love audience shows. So maybe a little bit more of that, but those are costly. So we appreciate all the founding members like yourself who help us do what we want to do.
No, I appreciate that. Was that was Head to Head? I've seen those videos. I didn't know that that was such a regular occurrence for you. Was that the one where you interviewed, was it Benny Morris and a couple of others?
Yes, just recently we brought it back after 4 years away. I interviewed the controversial Israeli historian Benny Morris in London and a Chinese government apologist called Victor Gao. And both those shows are on YouTube if you want to watch it. They've gone crazy viral. What's interesting is that is a show we used to do at the Oxford Union, the famous debate chamber, live in front of an audience. This year, the Oxford Union wasn't available, so we did it at Conway Hall in London. I'm going actually to London in a few weeks to do a couple more with a Trump advisor and with a British academic who's very anti-wokeness. So those should be fun.
Well, I'm definitely excited to see the sparring with Trump advisors. I thought like you were on a blacklist somewhere where basically any Trump official is like supposed to be as like far from you as humanly possible. That's so funny. So speaking of, I guess, media, I definitely want to talk about your style of interviews. But before I do, I should say that there's fresh news, a fresh indictment from the Justice Department indicated that Russia has been bankrolling tenant media, which includes right-wing content creators like Tim Pool and Lauren Chen, Benny Johnson, Lauren Southern. I guess my question is, are you surprised, and if so, to what extent, that Putin is so directly involved with right-wing media here in the United States?
No, I'm not surprised. I'm one of the people on the left who's actually taken the threat from Putin seriously for a long time. I don't believe this is all just a Russiagate hoax like some, you know, the Matt Taibbi's of this world and others want to claim. I think that if you look at Europe, for example, in Western Europe, we know that Putin and Russian government have been funding far-right movements, have been, you know, helping out the Le Pens of this world. So they've always had an interest in supporting the far-right because fundamentally, Russia went from being the far-left Soviet Union to a far-right authoritarian kleptocracy, you know, Christian nationalist, white nationalist under Vladimir Putin. And what's interesting is they don't just support the far right, they actually do much worse than that. They sow division, right? There's a very simple kind of nihilistic strategy, which is, you know, we know that in 2016, they also tried to fund pro-Bernie accounts, pro-Black Lives Matter accounts, pro-Jill Stein accounts. That doesn't mean that Jill Stein or Bernie Sanders or Black Lives Matter are kind of fronts for the Russian government, but it does mean that they exploit any division that they can find. That's been well documented. Now, we can argue about how big or small the threat is, and that's where there is a legitimate debate, but the idea that the Russian government doesn't get involved is absurd. So does the Iranian government, so does the Chinese government. So do we, by the way. Like, we're not exactly innocent, and the American American government gets involved in overseas elections and overseas politics all the time and always has done. So it's very naive to suggest that Putin wouldn't want to get involved, or the Russian government or Russian intelligence wouldn't want to play a role in our politics. There was a story recently about the Israeli government, a branch of the Israeli PR ministry funding fake accounts that were approaching black politicians in America, trying to get them to be more pro-Israeli online. So our allies do it, our enemies, our adversaries do it. And look, right-wing media is a very easy target because most of right-wing media these days consists of a bunch of grifters. So when you're a grifter, you'll take money from wherever you get it, no questions asked.
You mentioned Matt Taibbi, and which brings me to your style of interview. So you've helped popularize the British style of adversarial interview with America. And that style has fed ill-prepared American figures into the wood chipper. So you have Andrew Neil, what he did to Ben Shapiro virally, what you have done to Vivek Ramaswamy, Matt Taibbi, and even, we'll get to him later, but Piers Morgan, when he's at his best, he knows how to shred ill-prepared figures. So my question for you is, do you want to see the American media be more like the British style of media? Do you want it to be a mix? Do you want the Chuck Todds to become James O'Brien? What are you looking for?
Good references there. I'm a big fan of James O'Brien. Look, let's not, what's the phrase I'm looking for? Let's not sugarcoat, or let's not, look at the British media through too rosy tinted lenses, because the British media has a lot of problems. But yes, when it comes to the adversarial TV interview, the British media has been doing that for several decades. The BBC, ITV, started in around the 70s and the 80s. I was lucky enough when I graduated from university in the early 2000s to go work on one such show, which was called the Jonathan Dimbleby Show. It was a Sunday morning show in front of a live audience. And I write about it in my book, we spent days preparing that interview, preparing the questions, the research, the follow-up questions, the backup facts, plotting the entire interview. Do you, if the guest says this, if the guest says X, do you say Y? If the guest says Y, do you say Z? And we would have a whole plan, although back then I said Z. So that was the planning that we did. And I wish American interviews planned more, put more resources into interview shows, and yes, had a more combative style. Use whatever word you want: challenging, confrontational, combative, aggressive. These are all loaded words, but something that isn't just kind of softball central, or even where you have a tough question and then there's no follow-up. So yes, I've been saying this for about 9 years straight. I said it while I was at MSNBC for 3.5 years. And I do find it ironic. You mentioned Piers Morgan, you mentioned Andrew Neil as two British interviewers. Piers Morgan known to an American audience, Andrew Neil not, as Ben Shapiro found out to his cast. And I urge people to watch that hilarious clip where he accuses Andrew Neil, a famous British conservative, of being left-wing simply because he asked him tough questions. But I do find it not coincidental that some of the tough interviews that we've enjoyed over the last few years have come from people not brought up in an American media background. You look at the most famous Trump interview, the only Trump interview really that landed blows, was Jonathan Swan, my good friend then at Axios, now at the New York Times, who was of course Australian. And then yes, you look at my interview with a Ramaswamy or Eric Prince, to go back to head in my Al Jazeera English days. These are people who are interviewed all the time on American media. How come it takes someone like me or Jonathan Swan to come along and ask what other people haven't been asking?
So I guess my follow-up to that would be, how do you strike that balance? Because I find those interviews not just wildly entertaining, but extremely informative. But I imagine the consequence of that is you scare the hell out of people. You drive them away. That otherwise gettable interviews are no longer gettable because they're intimidated by the questions. So do you feel that there has to be a balance struck? Do you feel that you have to throw one punch but hold another because you don't want to pummel them proverbially into submission? How do you strike that balance?
A great question. It's one of the hardest questions we have to deal with. And look, a lot of the criticisms from liberals, from hashtag resistance folks against the quote unquote liberal media going soft on Trump is, oh, well, you're going soft because you want to maintain access. And I think there's some truth to that. But look, I sympathize with a lot of political correspondents on the Hill, a lot of White House correspondents, a lot of Sunday morning interviewers, right? If I had their jobs, I would have to think a lot about, if this is the toughest interview I ever do with Lindsey Graham, am I ever going to get Lindsey Graham back on? Now, I really wouldn't want to get Lindsey Graham back on, but I get why Sunday shows love to have Lindsey Graham on, so they don't go too tough on him.
I will say, Mehdi, just on the subject of Lindsey Graham, I didn't think about that, but that would be probably the worst mismatch ever, because when he gets a softball interview, he's nearly on the verge of tears anyway. So I feel that would be a bad idea.
Emotional and angry. Can you imagine? He'd walk out in 2 minutes. People say, "What would you do in a Trump interview?" I said, "It would last about 90 seconds because he's a snowflake and he'd walk out if he ever sat down with me." But look, I get the access issue. I do think it's exaggerated, right? I do think there's evidence that if you do tough interviews, you can still get good guests. And I think Chris Wallace at Fox News Sunday, back in his heyday, showed that you could. It was the only part of Fox that had any kind of journalism. And Chris Wallace did do tough interviews and still got guests back. I think, Jake Tapper has done some tough interviews. My old colleagues, Ali Velshi, Ayman Mohyuddin, Joy Reid, they've done tough interviews and got guests back. Joy Reid's done multiple clashes with Byron Donalds, the Republican congressman from Florida. He's come back on. A lot of these conservatives actually quite like a fight. Some of them are snowflakes, but some of them just like the confrontation. They like the challenge. They like the platform. They get a kick out of it. So no, it's not always the case that you won't get a guest back. I've done a very, very prominent right-wing guest who I'm about to do again soon. I can't say the name, but very soon.
Oh, now you're teasing us. See, you just dangle that out there, and now we have to salivate over it.
Surprisingly, they came to me and said, let's do it again. I said, okay.
Well, we mentioned Piers Morgan, and we have to address that particular elephant in the room. So I criticize Piers Morgan quite a bit on my channel, even though I think he has enormous talent. He has a great platform. He knows how to put out good content. And your interactions with him, both on Twitter and on Piers Morgan Uncensored, have been the stuff of legend. However, even though I know he's got the talent and the platform, when it comes to U.S. politics, I think he's a colossal disappointment. He says he's a nonpartisan journalist, but he is clearly not. So my question is, what do you think is the source of that? Like, when he has foreign policy interviews, he knows how to play the devil's advocate no matter who he's talking to. When it comes to U.S. politics, it's one softball after another. And then my follow-up to that is, has he ever responded when you took my suggestion and challenged him to come on Mehdi Unfiltered? Did he ever respond?
We've tried to get him on Mehdi Unfiltered. We've tried to get him. We're right now trying to get him on Head to Head, the Al Jazeera English show in London. While I'm in London, I'd love to do him in front of a crowd. Piers, if you're watching, we'd love to get you on Head to Head very soon. It's interesting because he always, if you watch those clashes, he always hides behind, Mehdi, you can't ask me questions. My show, I get to ask the questions. So it's like, all right, well, let's find a format where I do get to ask some questions, because I would like to pin him down on some of his views about American politics, because they're a little gelatinous. They're hard to pin to the wall. He kind of, as you say, evades, says, I'm nonpartisan, but I tend to share all these right-wing views just coincidentally. I tend to push whatever the latest right-wing moral panic is. And I think what it really comes down to is pretty simply that A, he is a conservative in his politics, even if he denies it, and B, he wants to be close to Donald Trump. Let's not forget, he was Trump's pal when Trump was in the White House. He did a bunch of interviews with Trump which weren't very aggressive. And then he called him out over January 6th. They fell out. Then he had an interview with him, and then Trump claimed it was badly edited and Morgan claimed it wasn't. Then they kind of fell out. Then they're friends again. Then they fall out. Then they're friends again. I think he sees that Trump is close to coming back to power, and he wants to be close to Donald Trump. It's that simple.
Fair enough. So we talk about Piers Morgan grading Trump on a curve. Let's just talk about that other bigger elephant in the room too, which is the American media. In my opinion, not just right-wing media, but so-called liberal mainstream media, CNN, the New York Times, and others, they grade Republicans and Trump on a curve, not just with respect to his personality, but also accomplishments, everything. What is the source of that in your estimation? And how much of a responsibility do professional journalists, so Jake Tapper, Kristen Welker, and everyone in between, how much of a professional and moral obligation do they have to correct it?
Oh, first of all, a huge moral obligation, especially at a time when democracy is under threat. I don't buy this crap about journalists being disinterested observers, just, bystanders. Peter Baker saying, well, I don't even vote to stay neutral. No, we have skin in the game, right? We are the fourth estate. There is no free press without a democracy. If democracy stops existing, we stop existing. So yes, we have skin in the game. We should have a bias towards democracy, small d democracy, not the big D Democratic Party, but definitely small d democracy. So yes, moral, political, ideological, career obligation to speak out on the Republican Party's ongoing extremism and radicalization. In terms of the kind of both sidesing and their grading on a curve, it's a great question. I've grappled with this for a long time. As you said, I've been an outsider, I've been an insider. I think there are multiple reasons. I think, for example, there's an intellectual laziness, which just says you go with the flow. This is how it's always been. This is what I will do, like all my colleagues. And there's a group thing, right? This is the consensus view. I'm not going to break with the consensus. There is, as you say, a grading on a curve, which says, well, they're so extreme that when they do anything vaguely non-extreme, we'll give them extra brownie points, like you would treat a child. I'll give her an extra spoon of dessert to my daughter because today she didn't throw everything on the floor. And I think there's that as well. I also think a lot of journalists, there's this whole thing about liberal bias. I think a lot of journalists are quite conservative, right? Look, we know that they have liberal social views on issues like abortion. Sure, most journalists in this country are quite socially liberal on gay rights, but on taxation, on the economy, on the role of the private sector, on the role of corporations, on immigration, on foreign policy issues. Actually, they're quite center-right, I would argue. And I think that also influences it. And then finally, there is you've been worked by the refs, right? The conservatives have spent years bullying the liberal media into believing that they are too liberal, too biased. They're against conservatives, and therefore journalists bend over backwards to overcompensate. And I think that's a lot of it as well.
So, okay, I wasn't planning on this follow-up too, but I'm going to throw this out there. One of my frustrations with it is even the framing of certain things. They refer to, the mainstream media and then like Fox News, but Fox is the single greatest, most successful part of legacy mainstream media. So like even just by definition, it frames
corporate media. What do they think Fox is?
Precisely. And, and there's also no analog that I found for all of media's faults. And there's no question there are faults there. But Fox and Newsmax seem to be, a breed apart, at least with legacy media. $787 million that they had to pay in that Dominion settlement. I mean, just the false equivalence even there. Are you surprised? I guess my follow-up to that is, are you surprised that after a nearly $1 billion payout, that Fox had no grand epiphany about, oh my God, maybe we should be very careful about how we frame
I'm not
things?
surprised about that at all. What I am surprised about is that other media organizations for a short period said, okay, we're not going to take Fox seriously as a news organization. And now they are again. I think the real issue with Fox is that Democratic Party politicians and other quote unquote liberal media organizations should stop treating them as a news organization. That should be the first step to dealing with Fox, is to ostracize them, isolate them, and treat them like the propaganda outlet that they are. Stop treating them as a news outlet. Stop calling them Fox News. Stop putting them in the front row at White House briefings and taking questions. Like, they're just not a news operation. Let's just be serious about that. And as for the kind of, the grading on the curve, the how bad it is, the framing, I'll give you one example that always killed me, even when I was at NBC and generally across the Sunday morning shows. You ever notice when they do panels, they have a right-wing pundit and they balance it with like a Peter Baker or a news reporter. It's almost internalizing the idea that our reporters are liberals and therefore the other person can be conservative. They don't have a Cenk Uygur or a proper lefty commentator who's going to, bring some fire, but they'll have a Eric Erickson or whoever it is on the right. And that really is quite telling when they do these panels, and the balance is your in-house reporter to the hardcore crazy conservative.
No doubt. You mentioned curves, and I want to say you were ahead of the curve when you referred to Donald Trump as a fascist. I think sooner than most people in mainstream media, and you've been encouraging people to say it for years. And I think there's no doubt that he is one. I guess my question is, you mentioned at the beginning that Donald Trump is on the cusp of returning to power, and it's a relatively like coin flip election. What do you say to people who say, Mehdi, regardless of whether or not he's a fascist, you need not worry because the guardrails constrained him in round one. We can be reasonably sure that they will constrain him in round two. We just have to last him for 4 years.
Yeah, it's just the dumbest and most naive argument that's out there right now. And I hear it from liberals, leftists, conservatives, apolitical people, normies. It's based on ignorance, unfortunately. When you look at the record, there's no evidence to believe that there will be any guardrails next time. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that the guardrails barely held last time, right? We came very close to actually losing our democracy in 2020. If a few election officials and a few judges had gone the other way, Donald Trump would be in a second term having lost the election. The real problem with the second Trump term in 2025 is Trump and his folks have not wasted time. They have spent the last few years seeing what the problems were that stopped them last time. And this time they come back, they're going to fire half the civil service because they see the deep state as an obstacle. They're going to take on the FBI and the DOJ and make them instruments of political power, as Project 2025 points out, because they see them as obstacles to their, naked power grab. There's not going to be any adults in the room. There's not going to be a John Kelly or a Rex Tillerson or a Jim Mattis or a Mark Esper. In the summer of 2020, Donald Trump told Mark Esper to open fire on the protesters in Lafayette Square outside the White House. Can't we just shoot them in the legs? And Esper said, no, of course we can't. There won't be an Esper next time. It'll be a Kash Patel or a Michael Flynn or a Rick Grinnell who will say, yes, sir, Mr. President, we'll shoot on them in the legs. And we won't realize until it's too late that there are no guardrails, that this imagination, this arrogance, this American exceptionalism says it can't happen here. No, America is not immune from the forces of fascism, authoritarianism that have plagued multiple other Western democracies in recent years. It's completely naive and ahistorical to suggest that we are immune from those forces. So no, Donald Trump's going to come back. He's going to go after his opponents. He's not hiding this stuff. I think it's the first fascist takeover in modern history where They're not denying any of this stuff. They'll open. Kash Patel goes on right-wing media and says, we're going to come after the media criminally and civilly. His words. Mike Davis, the guy who wants to be AG in a Trump second term, says, I'm going to send Mehdi Hasan to Guantanamo Bay. I'm going to denaturalize him. Great. This is the kind of stuff they're saying openly now. What do you think they're going to do when they're in power? Trump is all vengeance, all grievance, all retribution. There are no guardrails. Just stop pretending that the Supreme Court, 6-3 Supreme Court, is going to protect us from Donald Trump's fascism. It will not.
Yeah, if this is the Supreme Court providing guardrails, I'd like them to do anything else. I don't know how, sweeping presidential immunity constitutes a guardrail.
Before he's even won, they're like, here you go.
It's so interesting, too, because there are two things I want to just kind of unpack from that. Number one is, you talk about how Donald Trump isn't subtle and he's doing all this out in the open. One of the things I know is that you're a big pop culture junkie. And so I imagine, being a Star Wars fan or an MCU fan, you're aware of cinema's great villains. And I found it funny rewatching the Star Wars prequels, thinking, man, Palpatine should have just walked out into the Senate and announced who he was. He shouldn't have bothered with all this conspiracy. Just say who you are. And
Palpatine didn't have a MAGA cult to back him up, right? He didn't have Rand Paul and Ted Cruz and Mike Lee willing to be sycophants for him in the Imperial Senate. And not so much. I think he had to kill a bunch of people to get that kind of loyalty. Trump just had to say, Ted Cruz's wife is ugly, and Cruz just came on board.
Cruz bent the knee. It's reality is stranger than fiction. The other thing I'll say too is it's interesting, with your British background in particular, and I'm thinking of guardrails and I'm thinking of institutions. As an observer of British politics, it seems to me that even though we in the United States, and now you as a citizen, now that we have a written contiguous constitution, there is no contiguous written British constitution. You all have a sovereign. You still have a king who is above the law. And it seems like, I know the British system has its issues, but it seems more stable than what we have here, even though we have checks and balances on paper that are formalized. What's up with that? Have you noticed that it seems like the U.S. is more fraught than the
I
UK?
think the US is more fraught. I don't think that's got to do with the UK's unelected hereditary monarch. It is a constitutional monarchy. It is bound by law and the Constitution, even though we don't have a written constitution, a codified constitution. We do have a history of constitutional practices, text, traditions, which do bind the monarchy. But look, I think the real difference is not to do with the UK's particular system. I think it's to do with the fact that Western European democracies in general, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, UK, Canada, they still have reality-based conservative parties and reality-based electorates. And I think that's the difference. The reason why the Tory party in the UK, the Conservative Party, was thrown out and defeated in a massive landslide was not because there was great enthusiasm for the Labour Party. It's because people remembered what they did. People remembered that Boris Johnson broke the lockdown rules, wrecked the COVID response, went partying while people were dying. They remembered what Liz Truss did. She wrecked the economy. She couldn't outlast a lettuce. Like, they had a memory. They had an institutional memory, and they said, you know what? We're going to punish you for that. In this country, Donald Trump starts an insurrection, 500,000 people dies on his watch, and here he is back again, polling at 47, 48%, could win the presidential election. What? I mean, this country is full of goldfish. We have the memory of goldfish. Americans, I'm sorry, have a real amnesia problem in a way, and also obviously a reality-based problem. So you have millions of Americans who believe Donald Trump didn't do an insurrection. Donald Trump isn't a criminal. All this nonsense that they believe. And I think you don't have that in other Western conservative parties. So the British Conservative Party is more right-wing than it's ever been, but it's still not filled with open white supremacists and anti-vaxxers in the way that the modern Republican Party is.
No, and to be clear, I just think it's ironic, given that there's so much about the British system, which is relatively antiquated compared to a younger democracy like the United States. Like, even again, when it comes to a sovereign, the president is not supposed to be sovereign. He is a temporary chief executive. Yeah. And yet you have the Republican Party just eagerly, like they desperately want to give him sovereign immunity. And it's so despicable.
They're desperate for a dictator. The man who says he wants to be a dictator on day one, there are millions of Republicans who would love for him to be a dictator, love for him to be Palpatine.
Well, 100%. And it's so, I see no limiting principle with the GOP, as I know you don't either. Let's switch to the Democratic Party. So it's interesting. One of the things I really respect about you is you managed to walk this really, I think, a perilous tightrope with respect to your commentary, in the sense that before October 7th and even after, you consistently praised President Biden's extraordinary domestic agenda. And since October 7th in particular, you've obviously been an outspoken critic of President Biden and the Biden administration. And what's interesting is none of that has changed even today. You will, if you look at your Twitter feed, you're as likely to praise Biden's domestic policy and correct the record on that as you are to condemn him for his management of the war in Gaza. So many questions about that. Number one, is that intellectually and emotionally challenging? And number two, what have the social and reputational consequences been for holding that position?
It's a great question. I think intellectually, emotionally, yes, very difficult because, people, liberals will tell me, well, okay, he's bad on Gaza, but look at all the other stuff. And I will say, you can't really park a genocide, right? It's a moral issue of our time, a defining issue for me. It's very painful. And it's very, when people come to me and say, we can't vote for Democrats because they're complicit in war crimes. I get it, right? I get it. So that is a problem. And it is emotionally exhausting to have to walk on that tightrope to say, look, on this huge defining issue of our time, they failed. But on other issues, they've done well. That doesn't mean one cancels out the other. I'm just recognizing facts. Like, what annoys me is people who nihilistically say they're all the same. I wouldn't do what I did. I wouldn't be the person I am today. I wouldn't do what I do. I wouldn't do journalism. I'd go be an accountant. Not there's anything wrong with that, or some other job. If I believed they're all the same. If they're all the same, there's no point to anything. That's just BS. It's lazy. It's intellectually lazy. It's not true. Look at, for example, the Democratic Party's record on labor relations, something I care about. It's actually very good right now. That's all going to be lost under a Republican administration. So it is hard to walk that tightrope, especially when people are in their silos. And we've seen that with Zateo. We have a lot of subscribers who hate Biden for the genocide in Gaza. We have a lot of subscribers who see Harris and Biden as the only way of stopping Trump's fascism and say we must get behind blue no matter who. So that is a tightrope to walk, and people don't like to be challenged these days. I know we make fun of right-wingers and conservatives for their MAGA cult, but I wrote a piece for The Guardian recently about the blue MAGA cult. There are people on the Democratic side who just don't want to hear any criticism of any Democrat in office. And, you saw them when they rallied around Biden and pretended he's totally mentally fine. You're all just doing Trump's work by calling for him to go. Turns out we were right. He had to go and he wasn't mentally fine. So that is a problem. And in terms of the reputational issues, look, I was at all of Friday. I got attacked online from morning till afternoon for being an Iranian stooge and Hamas supporter from pro-Israel folks. Then I went to a mosque in Texas in the evening and did a Q&A and an event. And some of the people in the crowd were pissed at me because they think I'm not pro-Palestinian resistant enough. I'm too soft on Israel. So it goes with the territory, right? And I get attacked for being a Kamala Harris stooge. I get attacked by Kamala Harris supporters for being crazy lefty Bernie guy who's undermining the Democrats. So none of those things are true, but it is a cost that comes with saying things that don't fall in neat party lines or neat ideological lines or neat religious lines. I call it as I see it. So look, if Joe Biden does a good job on labor relations, I'll say Joe Biden did a good job on labor relations. If Joe Biden does a horrible job on Middle East policy, I'll say he does a horrible job on Middle East policy. I don't think they're not mutually exclusive. I think you can walk and chew gum at the same time. I wish more people would do it.
Fair enough. Last question when it comes to substantive politics. You have made it clear that you want the Democrats to win. You do think it is an imperative. I totally agree. As an American citizen, as a progressive, what would you advise Vice President Harris and Governor Walz to do to win the election if they were listening to Mehdi Hasan, which I'm sure they do?
It's not that I want the Democrats to win. It's that I believe Donald Trump has to be stopped and we have a two-party system and the Democrats are the only people who can stop it. I wish we had a multi-party system. We don't. I don't support a two-party system. I think it's antiquated, it's anti-democratic, it's turning people off politics, it's too narrow, but that's what we have. I think that Kamala Harris has done a very good job overall taking over the DNC, the vibes, the joy, the energy. You look at the funding numbers out today, she's raising far more money than Trump. It's interesting, so many people said, oh, Harris, she can't do it. When I wrote a piece for The Guardian saying Harris should take over from Biden, I was told by Democrats, no, she's not popular, she'll do a bad job, she won't get any money, she won't get any support in Pennsylvania. She's doing actually pretty well. And I think for me, of course, the big moral issue is Gaza and the big electoral issue is Gaza, right? Morally, I believe, morally and legally, I think she has to say something about and do something about our arms to Israel as they kill kids every day as we speak. It's against American law, against the Leahy law. It's against our basic moral principles to kill innocent civilians and punish them for what terrorists do. And I think electorally, I worry about places like Michigan and Georgia with significant Arab American, Muslim American, young progressive populations, Black American populations that are not on board with the Democratic Party's blind support for Israel and Netanyahu. And I think in a close election, every vote matters. I hear people say, well, we don't need their votes. Are you crazy? Again, have we forgotten? Why do we have this amnesia? In 2016, it came down to thousands of votes, not millions, not hundreds of thousands, not tens of thousands, but thousands of votes. So yeah, we need every vote. And I would like to see her shore up that part of the base, definitely going into November.
Perfect. Got three more questions. They all one word answers or less. Number one, There is one commentator whom I've not seen you have a conversation with that I think would be really good because you have some strong similarities with respect to wanting to take down the Republicans, but you also have some very stark differences with respect to foreign policy. That is Destiny. Would you have a conversation with Destiny?
No.
No. Number 2, what is your favorite MCU movie?
Oh, Civil War.
Civil War. Okay. And number 3, would you be open to having a follow-up conversation with me in the future?
Yes.
Perfect. Mehdi Hasan, I appreciate. Oh, fourth. I'm going to sneak a fourth one in there. You said something about Zateo making recommendations. I would like you to poach James O'Brien. I would like you to get him. I want a Mehdi Hasan, James O'Brien team up.
He's never going to leave LBC, but it's a good idea. It's a good thing to think about.